little apocalypse, this revealing, this lifting of the veil between what he sees and what is coming. And if we can't be perky and upbeat while we're there, we can at least be, as he was, honest. Honest and hopeful, actually, because I think underneath all of this, this is a hopeful passage, even if it doesn't sound like it. And a lot of that hopefulness hinges on that last word, birth pangs. Right? Birth pangs, the labor pain, the suffering, the convulsion, even the harm or the damage that is part of childbirth. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs, he says. All these false prophets and wars and natural disasters, all this pain and suffering and disruption and convulsion, even this damage that you will see and you will feel around you, these are birth pangs. These are the labor of bringing something new into the world. He didn't have to say birth pangs, I don't think. He could have said something like death throes, right? Another kind of painful convulsion, this thrashing resistance sometimes in a body's last moments of life. He could have said death throes, and that would have made sense. All these horrible people and the constant wars and this violent earth, they are all the last painful shudderings of a dying world and a way of being that will be no more. They're all passing away to make room for something new. This is all coming down like the temple. You just need to endure it in a way that almost fits the spirit of the passage a little bit better, doesn't it? But he doesn't say that. He says birth pangs. So what do we do with that? I think we say again that makes this passage hopeful. That's a good place to start, because then this isn't just a rant about how horrible things are, some easy anarchic burn it all down and start again, or some nihilistic existence is futile and life is meaningless. Calling these birth pangs means, one, that there is something more coming, that this is not all there is. Whether we live to see it or not, something new is being born. Which also then means that this pain is in some way purposeful, which is very different. This is not useless, wasted suffering. This, again, in ways that we can't understand, this is part of being a part of bringing something new into the world. It means that maybe someday, if we were ever afforded a long enough view, we would see it all as worth it. That this labor was worth it, that these birth pangs brought something beautiful to life. That said, I want to be careful about that. I think we sometimes have to be careful with saying things like that, because if we read something like this about war and suffering and disaster and how it's all really part of something good, and we read that wrong and we get really close to some bad ideas like all that is wrong in the world, violence and injustice and oppression and disaster, all of that is somehow inevitable. And not only inevitable, but somehow necessary and therefore a part of God's plan and therefore all fine, which is the other really dangerous idea that all this suffering is somehow good and redemptive and God requires it, right? A lot of people have done a lot of harm by thinking that all their warring madness is doing God's work, or that all the suffering that others are going through is okay because it exists, so it must be a part of God's plan. That's not what Jesus is saying. I think what he is saying is that this is what a world caught in the constant convulsions of birth pangs and death throes feels like and looks like. It has, and it does, and for some time at least it likely will. I think there's a reason that at one point or another, every generation has had some sense of, well, this must be the end times right now, because look at this. All the ingredients are here. But I don't know that these are signs of the end of the world as much as they are symptoms of how things are. Something is always dying, something is always being born, and either way, none of it is pretty, none of it is easy, and most of it hurts. And when Jesus says, when you see these things, don't be alarmed, he doesn't mean don't care about them and don't let them affect you. Right? Because everything else Jesus ever taught us about how to be still applies. Be peacemakers. Love the vulnerable. Don't make this let you lose hope. Don't be alarmed by these things means something more like don't let these things shake your faith. Just because these horrible things exist, don't let them make you think God doesn't exist. Just because these things are happening doesn't mean that what we're doing together isn't working. It is working. And in the middle of all these things, God is working. Don't give up. If nothing else, maybe this language of birth pangs and death throes is another way we can see the world. And maybe it's another lens through which we can see one another's pain more clearly and understand it more fully. We can see the pain and the disruption and the convulsions and the anger and the nastiness and the fear and the hatred, some of the ways we are being horrible to one another. And behind all that sound and fury, usually are some mix of death throes and birth pangs. We have a lot of people grieving right now, scared to death about what they are losing or what they're afraid they're losing. And there's a lot of people who are working really hard to do something, try something, create something, and they're watching it be frustrated and torn down in every step of the way. Again, whether it's birth pangs or death throes, none of it's pretty, none of it's easy, and usually it hurts. And if we're honest, I think most of that is happening in most of us most of the time. It isn't one or the other. Most of us all the time are grieving and hoping, losing and gaining, watching something we love be torn down and building something new all at once, most of the time. Which means there's a challenge to the church in this. Who does the church need to be to a world going through this? Part of what it means is we better get used to being chaplains and midwives. Because both the death throes and the birth pangs are real. And they're valid, and they're difficult, and we need to attend faithfully to both. To the parts of the world and to the parts of ourselves that are feeling the death throes, that are resisting letting things go, that are grieving what we loved and are now losing. We need to be as gentle and comforting as chaplains. And to those in labor pains who are struggling to do something new and good, we need to be as wise and encouraging as midwives. If nothing else, we have to be here for all of it and name all of it and try to honor all of it, because it's all happening. And the same is true about church itself. This moment we're in, and by church I mean the church, big C, and I mean all the churches that I know, and I mean this church. This moment that we're in of disruption and uncertainty, this extended in-between season, this isn't just a COVID thing. Not that COVID is helping, I want to be clear about that. But if anything, as people have noted, everywhere at this point, COVID didn't so much cause many of these changes so much as COVID is accelerating changes that were decades in the making. Changes in what we believe about church, in church's role in society, in how we engage with a church, with what we're looking for from church, all of which changes who and how we are as a church. And without going through all of that right now, at least we can ask with everyone else who is asking, and by everyone else I mean every other pastor in church that I know, what's going on? Where is everybody? Where is this all going? What happens if we have no idea? Then what do we do? And even, what if we die? Which is a question a lot of churches are closer than we are to having to ask. But it might be the question behind all those other questions. When churches ask, what's going on? Where is everybody? Where's this all going? What if we can't fix it? The question behind that is often, and if we can't, what if we die? We have this sense that we are no longer what we were, but we're not yet a new thing. And we can't recover how things used to be, but we can't see how they will be. And all the disruption and anxiety and pain and grieving we're feeling in that, are these birth pangs or are they death throes? And the answer, of course, is yes. Yes. At church, we are grieving and hoping, losing and gaining, watching what we loved go away and build something new all at once, just about all the time. Which means part of our ministry now is to be chaplains and midwives here, too, to one another. To attend faithfully to the real loss and to work hard at the places of inspiration and energy. Because this disruption, this temporary disruption, will likely last the rest of our lives. This will not be over. We will not be here to see the end of it. If we're waiting for things to go back to normal, especially if by normal we mean the way that we knew them a decade or 2 or 4 ago, if we're trying to recover that, we can give up on that goal. It isn't happening here. It isn't happening anywhere. And it's not getting different anytime soon. That may also not sound particularly perky or upbeat, and it may not fit the way that we want to feel. But like this passage, it's also honest. And in its own way, I think it's also hopeful. Because the other challenge of our ministry is to have the faith that no matter what happens, it will be okay. And not okay in the sense that we'll get what we want, or that it will be what we expected, or even that we can make what we loved live forever. But okay in the sense that God's got this, whatever form we as the church take. And if we keep at the work that God's given us, being peacemakers, loving our enemies, holding fast to compassion, protecting the vulnerable, doing justice, loving kindness, walking humbly with God, if we keep at that work, we will become whoever God is calling us to be, whatever that turns out to be. Just because it isn't always pretty or easy or pleasant doesn't mean that what we're doing together isn't working. It is working. And in the middle of all of it, God is working. In faith, we can make some peace with our own impermanence and not give up. In faith, that in ways that we can understand or cannot understand ahead of time and may not live to see finished, we are part of bringing something new into the world. And someday we'll know that all this labor will be worth it, and that these birth pangs brought something beautiful to life. Thanks be to God. Amen.